What if the one man who could have stopped the September 11th attacks was not only ignored, but silenced? What if the most knowledgeable, most obsessed, most relentless agent in the entire US government, the man who knew Osama bin Laden's name when others couldn't pronounce it, was systematically undermined, blocked, and ultimately forced out of the very job where he could prevent the unthinkable? This isn't a work of fiction. It's the story of a man who saw the future with terrifying clarity. And when his own government wouldn't listen, his final act was not one of defiance, but of impossible, tragic irony. This is the story of John P. O'Neill. John O'Neill did not look like your typical G-man. In the gray, conformist halls of the FBI, he was a splash of color. His suits were tailored, perfectly pressed, a dark uniform of bespoke quality. His shoes were shined to a mirror finish. He always seemed to be holding a lit cigar and a cold martini, exuding an air of swagger that felt more suited to a smoky jazz club than a sterile federal building. Some called him the Prince of Darkness for his late-night habits and his dark Irish looks. But behind the expensive facade was a mind of singular, obsessive focus. For O'Neill, his job was not a career. It was a calling, a religion. He joined the FBI in 1976, straight out of American University, and quickly built a reputation as a prodigy in white-collar crime and foreign counterintelligence. But it wasn't financial criminals that would come to define him. It was a new, shadowy enemy that few in America yet understood. His education in this new form of warfare began in a cloud of smoke and twisted steel, right in the heart of New York City. February 26, 1993. A truck bomb detonates in the garage beneath the North Tower of the World Trade Center. It kills 6 people, injures over 1,000, and carves a crater 7 stories deep. For most of America, it was a shocking but isolated criminal act. For John O'Neill, it was a revelation. It was the first trumpet blast of a coming war. As an agent in the New York field office, he dove into the investigation. And in the complex web of evidence, one name kept emerging from the shadows: a radical blind cleric named Ammar Abdel-Rahman, and his distant wealthy benefactor, a Saudi financier by the name of Osama bin Laden. For O'Neill, bin Laden was no longer a phantom. He was a face, a name, a direct threat. While the rest of the world was enjoying the supposed end of history in the post-Cold War 90s, O'Neill was studying a new kind of holy war. He became a walking encyclopedia of this nascent threat, collecting books, documents, and contacts. He believed with an almost religious fervor that the 1993 bombing was not an end. It was a rehearsal. His superiors noticed. O'Neill's obsessive drive and his theatrical personality could be grating, but his results were undeniable. In 1995, they promoted him. He was brought to FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., and made chief of the counterterrorism section. He was now, officially, America's top terrorist hunter. His office became a shrine to his obsession. Maps covered the walls, linking disparate events from the Philippines to New Jersey. Charts connected a sprawling network of names, faces, and phone numbers. He worked relentlessly, sleeping on a cot in his office, his life consumed by the hunt. His personal life was complicated. He maintained relationships with multiple women, juggling a private life that was as complex and compartmentalized as his professional one. It was a flaw, a vulnerability that his enemies in the Bureau would later use against him. But in the mid-90s, he was at the height of his power. He felt the world was finally catching up to his fears. He believed the system, the great machinery of the FBI, was now pointed in the right direction. He was at the helm, and he was ready for the fight. And then, on August 7, 1998, the fight came to him. Two almost simultaneous truck bombs explode outside the U.S. embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. 224 people are killed, including 12 Americans. Thousands are wounded. The attacks are coordinated, devastating, and symbolic. From his command center in Washington, O'Neill knew instantly who was responsible. He didn't need to wait for the evidence. This was the signature of the man he'd been tracking for 5 years. This was Osama bin Laden's grand declaration of war on the United States. For the FBI and for John O'Neill, the training exercise was over. The hunt was now live. O'Neill flies to the bomb sites, wading through the rubble, his crisp suit covered in dust. He sees the carnage firsthand. This isn't theoretical anymore. It isn't about charts on a wall. It's about bodies and blood and a clear and present danger to his country. He returns to Washington with a renewed, almost fanatical sense of purpose. He famously coins a phrase that becomes his mantra, his warning to anyone who will listen: "We are at war." The problem was, most of America and most of the U.S. government didn't know it yet. And his crusade to convince them would put him on a collision course with the very system he had sworn to serve. John O'Neill's war against Al-Qaeda was also a war against inertia. He found himself battling not just terrorists in the mountains of Afghanistan, but bureaucrats in the cubicles of Washington. His first major enemy was the wall between the FBI and the Central Intelligence Agency. The FBI was a law enforcement body. Their job was to build court cases, collecting evidence, making arrests, and seeking convictions. The CIA was an intelligence agency. Their job was to gather secrets, often using methods that would never hold up in a court of law. This created a chasm of information. O'Neill, the FBI agent, needed CIA intelligence to stop the next attack. But the CIA was reluctant to share its sources and methods, fearing it would compromise their operations. O'Neill would plead, argue, and shout in meetings. "They're planning to kill us," he'd say, "and you're worried about whose turf this is?" To him, it was madness. He was trying to prevent mass murder, and others were focused on protocol and jurisdiction. He established his own informal network of contacts within the CIA and foreign intelligence services, going around his superiors to get the information he needed. This made him effective. It also made him enemies. Powerful people inside the Beltway began to see O'Neill not as a brilliant agent, but as a rogue elephant, uncontrollable, insubordinate, and far too comfortable with the media. His confident demeanor was reinterpreted as arrogance. His tireless work ethic was seen as a desire for personal glory. The simmering resentment finally boiled over in the dust of Yemen. October 12, 2000. A small suicide boat packed with explosives rams the side of the USS Cole, a guided missile destroyer refueling in the port of Aden. 17 American sailors are killed. 37 are wounded. The ship is nearly sunk. Within hours, O'Neill is on a plane, leading the FBI's investigation team. He arrives in Yemen ready to hunt down the bombers, who he again presumes are linked to bin Laden. But he doesn't just face a shadowy terrorist cell. He faces a stone wall in the form of the U.S. ambassador to Yemen, Barbara Bodine. Ambassador Bodine viewed Yemen as her personal domain. She saw O'Neill and his army of over 100 FBI agents not as investigators, but as a security threat. She worried his aggressive, American-style investigation would upset the delicate diplomatic balance she had cultivated with the Yemeni government. From the moment he landed, she began to undermine him. She restricted his agents' movements. She refused to allow them to carry long arms for protection in a hostile environment. She complained to Washington that O'Neill was being rude and culturally insensitive. O'Neill was furious. His sailors were dead. His investigation was being strangled by diplomatic red tape. He saw Boudin's actions as a catastrophic failure to understand the stakes. She's trading sailors' lives for political courtesy, he fumed to his team. Their public clashes became legendary. Finally, after weeks of obstruction, O'Neill returned to Washington in protest, hoping his superiors would back him. They did not. Instead, they took Ambassador Boudin's side. O'Neill was ordered to stand down. His investigation into the USS Cole bombing, the direct attack on the U.S. military, was effectively crippled. For John O'Neill, this was the ultimate betrayal. He had now seen up close how bureaucracy and petty politics could take precedence over national security. He returned to his office a changed man. His swagger was still there, but it was edged with a deep, corrosive frustration. He began warning everyone with a new and desperate intensity. He told his friends, his colleagues, his sons, something big is coming. He didn't know the exact time or place, but he knew the players, he knew their intent, and he knew America was a sleeping giant. And while O'Neill was screaming his warnings into the void, his own organization was quietly building a case against him. They scrutinized his expense reports. They investigated his complicated love life. They were hunting for any infraction, any misstep they could use to sideline the Bureau's most difficult and most prescient agent. They found it in a simple mistake. In the summer of 2001, O'Neill attended a conference in Orlando, Florida. He briefly left his briefcase, which contained classified documents, in a secure conference room. When he returned, it was gone. He immediately reported it, and the briefcase was recovered a few hours later, unopened. In the grand scheme of things, it was a minor breach of protocol. But for O'Neill's enemies, it was the weapon they had been waiting for. An internal investigation was launched. News of the lost briefcase was leaked to the New York Times. It was a calculated, career-ending humiliation. This is the one thing revelation. At the exact same time that John O'Neill was being investigated for a misplaced briefcase, other, far more important pieces of information were flowing into the U.S. intelligence community. In Arizona, an FBI agent named Kenneth Williams writes a memo. It's known today as the Phoenix Memo. He warns that a disturbing number of men with suspected terrorist ties, many of them Middle Eastern, are enrolling in American flight schools. He speculates that bin Laden may be trying to use civilian airliners as weapons. The memo is sent to FBI headquarters, and it languishes. It never reaches O'Neill's desk. In Minnesota, FBI agents arrest a man named Zacharias Moussaoui. He paid cash for flight simulator training on a Boeing 747, but showed no interest in learning how to take off or land. The agents are deeply suspicious and believe he may be part of a larger plot to hijack an airliner. They fight for weeks to get a warrant to search his laptop. The request is denied by their superiors at FBI headquarters. Imagine it. John O'Neill, the world's foremost expert on Al-Qaeda, is sitting in his office in Washington, just down the hall from the unit that is stonewalling the Moussaoui investigation. He has dedicated his life to connecting these exact kinds of dots. But the two most important dots in the history of the Bureau are intentionally kept from him. The system he served, a system now focused on destroying his career over a briefcase, was actively concealing the very clues that would have confirmed his darkest fears. He was being silenced, and the clock was ticking. The internal investigation and the public humiliation were the final push. John knew his career at the FBI was over. They had won. The bureaucrats, the rivals, the diplomats, they had finally found a way to remove the man who made them uncomfortable, the man whose warnings were too loud, too persistent, too dire. In August of 2001, after 25 years of service, John formally resigned from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He was bitter, but he was also relieved. He told friends he was tired of fighting, tired of pushing against a system that refused to move. He had given his entire adult life to the FBI, and in the end, it had broken his heart. He needed a new job, preferably one in the private sector where he could finally make some real money and put his complicated personal finances in order. A headhunter came to him with an offer. It was a prestigious, high-paying position, a security job. He would be the new chief of security at the World Trade Center. He accepted. The irony was not lost on him. His career hunting bin Laden had begun with the 1993 bombing of the Twin Towers. Now he would end his career by protecting them. On his first day of work, he reportedly joked with a friend, "At least here, the worst that can happen is that some tourist gets their pocket picked." He started his new job on August 23, 2001. On the evening of September 10, 2001, John was having a drink with friends at a pub near the World Trade Center. He was in a good mood, feeling liberated from the confines of the FBI. The conversation, as it often did, turned to bin Laden. O'Neill repeated his now familiar warning. "We're due," he said. "And we're due for something big." The next morning, on September 11th, John was at his desk in his new office on the 34th floor of the North Tower when American Airlines Flight 11 struck the building about 60 floors above him. He immediately went into action. He called his son, his girlfriend, and his colleagues at the FBI. He assured them he was okay. Then, he did what he had always done. He ran toward the danger. He helped coordinate the evacuation of his office and worked his way down to the ground floor. Once he was safely outside, he stood on the pavement and stared up at the burning towers. He could have left. He was out. But that wasn't John O'Neill. He was a protector. He saw people in need of help, of direction. Reports from that day say he showed his old FBI badge to a fire marshal and went back inside the South Tower to assist with the rescue operations. He was last seen walking into the command center, just moments before the South Tower collapsed. John O'Neill, the man who had chased Osama bin Laden across the globe, the man who had screamed warnings about an impending catastrophic attack, died in the rubble of the very target he had first identified and last protected. He was 49 years old. His body was found in the wreckage of the World Trade Center 10 days later. In the wake of the attacks, the country and the world learned what John O'Neill had been trying to tell them for years. The 9/11 Commission Report, a sweeping investigation into the failures that led to the attacks, would read like a posthumous vindication of his entire career. It criticized the FBI for its inability to connect the dots. It condemned the lack of information sharing between agencies. It detailed how the Phoenix memo was ignored, and how the arrest of Zacarias Moussaoui was catastrophically mishandled. The report exposed the very systemic failures that had so frustrated O'Neill, the very walls he had smashed his head against, the very bureaucratic inertia that had cost him his job, and, ultimately, his life. He became a symbol of a particular kind of American tragedy. He was a Cassandra in a Brooks Brothers suit, a man cursed with foresight in a nation suffering from a failure of imagination. He was brilliant, and he was flawed. He was a hero, and he was a casualty. His life story serves as a permanent, classified file on what can happen when the right man with the right information is in the wrong system at the wrong time. In the end, John O'Neill was a man consumed by two obsessions: hunting Osama bin Laden and the Federal Bureau of Investigation. In a final, cruel twist of fate, one would define his life, and the other would help to define his death. He was the guardian who saw the storm coming, and his warnings were lost in the marbled halls of the very institution he loved, right up until the moment the sky fell down. This file is now closed, but the archives are vast. To be the first to know when the next dossier is opened, subscribe to Federal Confidential and turn on notifications. In the comments below, let us know which secret story needs to be told next.